The warden's pen froze mid-signature on the execution order, her weathered hand trembling as the condemned man's final words echoed through the sterile death row corridor. "I don't want a priest or a last meal," Ethan Cross whispered, his voice barely audible through the reinforced glass. "I just want to see Thunder one more time." The clipboard clattered to the concrete floor as Rebecca Stone stared at the man she was about to kill in 3 hours and 30 minutes. A bull. He wanted to see a bull. Down the hallway, Thunder, all 200 pounds of black and red-brown Brahmin, hadn't eaten a full meal in 1,847 days, the exact number of days since his human had been torn away in handcuffs. The massive animal's ribs now showed through his dull coat, his once proud frame withered by a grief that defied every veterinary explanation. "Get Sarah Matthews on the phone," Stone commanded her assistant, her professional composure cracking. Now. What had this dying bull been protecting all these years, and why did the sight of an innocent man's tears make her question everything she thought she knew about justice? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 5 years earlier, Cross Creek Ranch had been a slice of Texas heaven nestled in the rolling hills where bluebonnets painted the landscape each spring. Ethan Cross, 33 then and still carrying the invisible wounds of 3 tours in Afghanistan, had found his salvation in the most unlikely companion. A scrawny Brahmin calf destined for slaughter. The day Ethan first laid eyes on Thunder at the Fredericksburg livestock auction, the young bull was barely 200 pounds of trembling black and red-brown hide. While other buyers examined prize cattle, Ethan found himself drawn to the rejected calf cowering in the corner pen. Something in those intelligent brown eyes reminded him of his own reflection during the worst nights of PTSD. Lost, abandoned, waiting for someone to care. "That one's headed for the meat truck," the auctioneer had warned. "Too small, wrong bloodline, probably diseased." But when Ethan approached the pen, the calf stopped trembling. Their eyes met, and in that moment, 2 broken souls recognized each other. Ethan paid $300 for what others considered worthless meat. Thunder grew into a gentle giant under Ethan's patient care, defying every stereotype about aggressive bulls. The Marine veteran, struggling with nightmares and anxiety attacks, found peace in Thunder's steady presence. When panic seized Ethan in the middle of the night, Thunder would somehow sense it, positioning his massive frame against the ranch house window, a silent guardian until dawn. Sarah Matthews had fallen in love with both man and bull simultaneously. As the local large animal veterinarian, she'd been called to examine Thunder during his first week at the ranch. She expected to find a typical rancher with typical livestock. Instead, she discovered Ethan teaching Thunder to respond to hand signals, the bull's intelligence rivaling any dog she'd treated. "I've never seen anything like this," Sarah had marveled, watching Thunder gently accept children from the neighboring Henderson farm onto his back for rides. "He's not just trained, he actually cares about people." Martha Henderson, 80 years old even then, became Thunder's unofficial grandmother. Every morning for 5 years, she walked the fence line between their properties, sharing her breakfast biscuits and one-sided conversations with the attentive bull. "You're the grandbaby I always wanted," she'd tell him, scratching behind his ears. "Better than any of those California grandsons who never call." Ethan's security business thrived, specializing in protection for wealthy ranchers throughout the hill country. His military training, combined with Thunder's uncanny ability to sense danger, made them an unbeatable team. Thunder could detect intruders from half a mile away, his subtle ear movements alerting Ethan to threats before any human could notice. The engagement party had been planned for the weekend after Samuel Morrison's murder changed everything. Sarah's pregnancy announcement was written in cards that were never sent. Thunder's breeding program, designed to create more therapy animals for veterans, existed only in business plans that gathered dust. Now, as Warden Stone's call rang through to Sarah's veterinary clinic, Thunder lay motionless in his stall, another piece of his heart dying with each passing hour. The prison's loading dock had never accommodated a livestock trailer, much less a dying Brahman bull whose labored breathing echoed through the concrete corridors like a funeral dirge. Sarah Matthews stood beside Thunder's massive form, her veterinary training warring with her breaking heart as monitors showed his weakening vital signs. "Ma'am, we can't authorize this," Deputy Warden Murphy protested, his clipboard trembling in his hands. "A bull weighs more than most cars. If something goes wrong, then you'll have 2 deaths on your conscience today instead of 1, Sarah snapped, her usual professional composure cracking under the weight of 5 years' worth of suppressed grief. The pregnancy hormones didn't help, making every emotion feel amplified and raw. Warden Stone studied the scene with calculating eyes. In 30 years of corrections work, she'd seen plenty of last requests. Final meals, religious ceremonies, visits from estranged family members. But this dying animal represented something she couldn't quite name, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the man she was scheduled to execute in 90 minutes. "Get the largest holding cell ready," Stone finally decided, "and call maintenance to remove any furniture that might become a projectile if that bull panics." Thunder's transport into the prison required a forklift and 8 correctional officers, the bull's semi-conscious form strapped to a specially constructed platform. Dr. Foster monitored his heart rate continuously, shaking her head at readings that should have killed him already. "I've never seen anything like this," the veterinarian murmured to Sarah. "His body is shutting down, but it's like he's refusing to die until something specific happens. Animals don't typically show this kind of purpose." In cell block D, Ethan Cross sat motionless on his narrow bunk, staring at hands that would be restrained in less than 2 hours. The sounds of unusual activity in the corridor, heavy machinery, unfamiliar voices, the distinctive rumble of diesel engines penetrated his meditation on mortality. Reverend William Tucker found Ethan exactly as he'd left him the previous evening, calm, resigned, but maintaining his innocence with quiet dignity. At 65, Tucker had ministered to dozens of condemned men, and he'd learned to recognize the difference between guilt and grief. Ethan Cross carried only the latter. "The warden has granted your request," Tucker said softly, settling into the plastic chair that served as his confessional. "Thunder is here." Ethan's composure finally cracked. 5 years of forced stoicism crumbled as tears he'd refused to shed rolled down his weathered cheeks. "How is he?" Tucker's silence answered more clearly than words could have. The reunion took place in what had once been the prison's automotive bay, a cavernous space normally used for vehicle maintenance but hastily converted into an impromptu meeting room. Thunder lay on a thick bed of hay, his massive head supported by veterinary equipment that kept him stable but conscious. When Ethan entered, escorted by 4 guards and shackled at ankles and wrists, Thunder's response was immediate and heartbreaking. The bull's eyes, dulled by pain and medication, suddenly blazed with recognition. A sound escaped his throat, part moan, part cry, entirely human in its expression of joy and despair. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered, kneeling beside Thunder's head with awkward movements restricted by his restraints. The guards had orders to maintain distance but allow contact, a compromise that satisfied neither security nor compassion. Thunder tried to lift his head, succeeding only in raising it a few inches before exhaustion forced him back down. But those few inches were enough for him to press his muzzle against Ethan's palm, the familiar gesture they'd shared countless times over 8 years of partnership. Sarah watched from across the room, her heart breaking as she witnessed what she'd dreamed of for 5 years, her 2 boys together again. but the circumstances made the reunion more tragedy than triumph. "He's been waiting for you," she told Ethan, her voice barely audible. "Every day for 5 years, he's positioned himself at the gate, watching for your truck. Even when he could barely stand, he'd drag himself there each morning." Martha Henderson arrived during this tender moment, her 85-year-old frame moving with surprising urgency. But she wasn't alone. The elderly woman who'd fed Thunder biscuits every morning for 5 years was accompanied by 2 men in dark suits whose bearing screamed federal agents. "Ethan," Martha said, her voice carrying authority that hadn't been there during their neighborly conversations over the fence, "we need to talk. And Thunder needs to show us something." The revelation of Martha's true identity as retired FBI Director Martha Hendricks sent shockwaves through the assembled group. Even Warden Stone, accustomed to bureaucratic surprises, struggled to process the implications. "I've been investigating Marcus Kellerman for 20 years, Martha explained, producing a federal badge that looked ancient but authentic. Samuel Morrison's murder was part of a pattern stretching back decades. Kellerman eliminates anyone who threatens his land acquisition schemes, and he's gotten very good at framing convenient scapegoats." Detective Kane burst into the room at that moment, his arms loaded with evidence boxes and his face flushed with the excitement of breakthrough. "We've got him," he announced breathlessly. Financial records, suppressed forensic evidence, witness statements, enough to bury Kellerman and half the county government. But Thunder, despite his failing condition, was exhibiting increasingly agitated behavior. The bull's attention fixated on something specific, and his distress grew more pronounced as he tried to communicate what he couldn't verbalize. "He's trying to tell us something," Sarah observed, her veterinary instincts reading Thunder's body language. "Look at how he's positioning himself. He's not just reacting to Ethan, he's trying to show us something." Dr. Foster had been monitoring Thunder's vital signs throughout the emotional reunion, but something in the bull's behavior caught her medical attention. His stress indicators are spiking, but not in a negative way. It's almost like anticipation. Ethan, still shackled but now permitted to move more freely around Thunder's makeshift bed, noticed the bull's focus on his prison uniform. Thunder was pawing weakly at the orange fabric, his nostrils flaring as if detecting a specific scent. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, following Thunder's gaze to his own clothing. "What are you trying to show me?" Martha Henderson stepped forward, her decades of federal investigation experience recognizing significant behavior when she saw it. Animals have senses far beyond human capabilities. If Thunder witnessed the murder, he may have retained sensory memories that could provide evidence. The breakthrough came when Thunder, using the last reserves of his strength, managed to regurgitate something onto the hay beside him. The object was small, metallic, and unmistakably man-made, a fragment of jewelry that gleamed despite being corroded by stomach acid. Dr. Foster immediately recognized the medical implications. "He's been carrying this in his digestive system for years," she announced, carefully collecting the evidence with sterilized instruments. The metal fragment shows signs of prolonged exposure to gastric acid, consistent with deliberate ingestion and retention. Detective Kane examined the fragment with a magnifying glass, his experienced eye recognizing its significance immediately. "It's part of a ring, custom design, expensive craftsmanship, and there's an engraving, partial but readable enough for identification." The engraving read, "M.K. 1995, Marcus Kellerman's initials, and the year he'd graduated from law school." Martha Henderson smiled grimly. Thunder didn't just witness the murder. He preserved the evidence. That bull swallowed a piece of the killer's ring during the struggle, probably when Kellerman grabbed Samuel Morrison. The implications rippled through the room like shock waves. Thunder had carried the proof of Ethan's innocence inside his own body for 5 years, his animal instincts understanding what the human justice system had failed to grasp. But the revelation came at a devastating cost. The effort of regurgitating the evidence had exhausted Thunder's remaining strength. His vital signs plummeted as Dr. Foster worked frantically to stabilize him. "We're losing him," she announced grimly. "The stress of the evidence expulsion has triggered complete cardiac failure." Ethan, still shackled but no longer caring about protocol, stretched out beside Thunder's massive head. The bull's breathing grew increasingly labored, but his eyes remained fixed on his human's face with an expression of profound satisfaction. "You did it, boy," Ethan whispered, tears streaming freely. "You saved me. You've been trying to save me all along." Outside the makeshift medical bay, federal agents were coordinating Marcus Kellerman's arrest. The casino developer, caught attempting to board a private jet at Austin Bergstrom International Airport, had been taken into custody based on the DNA evidence from the ring fragment. But inside the prison's automotive bay, the only sound was Thunder's laboring breath and the quiet sobs of people who'd learned too late that justice sometimes came with an unbearable price. The bull who'd waited 5 years to save his human was finally letting go. The emergency courthouse hearing convened at 11:30 a.m. in Judge Harold Blackstone's chambers, a mahogany-paneled sanctuary where justice had been perverted for over a decade. Federal agents flanked the entrance as prosecutors, defense attorneys, and law enforcement officials crowded into the space normally reserved for private deliberations. Judge Blackstone entered with the measured gait of a man accustomed to wielding absolute power, his black robes flowing like the wings of some dark bird of prey. At 62, he'd presided over hundreds of cases, but none had attracted this level of federal scrutiny. The presence of FBI Director Martha Hendricks, a woman he'd believed to be a harmless ranch neighbor, sent ice through his veins. "Your Honor," District Attorney Patricia Wells began, her voice tight with political calculation, "new evidence has emerged in the Cross case that requires immediate judicial review." Detective Kane stepped forward, placing the metal ring fragment in an evidence bag on Blackstone's bench. "DNA analysis confirms this belongs to Marcus Kellerman. The fragment was recovered from the digestive system of Thunder, the defendant's bull, who apparently swallowed it during the Morrison murder." Blackstone's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his gavel. For 10 years, he'd been Marcus Kellerman's silent partner, ensuring that inconvenient witnesses disappeared and troublesome cases were decided in favor of the Casino Development Consortium. The offshore payments had funded his son's medical treatments, his wife's cancer care, and his daughter's law school education. "This is highly irregular," Blackstone stated, his judicial training warring with personal panic. "Evidence recovered from an animal's digestive system raises serious questions about chain of custody and admissibility." Martha Hendricks spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. "Your Honor, with respect, this court is no longer the appropriate venue for these proceedings. Federal agents are prepared to assume jurisdiction based on evidence of interstate conspiracy and corruption reaching into this very courtroom." The accusation hung in the air like sulfur. Blackstone's lifetime of judicial immunity meant nothing against federal charges, and everyone in the room understood the implications. Meanwhile, in the prison's makeshift medical bay, Thunder's condition had deteriorated beyond Dr. Foster's ability to stabilize. The massive bull's heart rate fluctuated wildly between dangerous bradycardia and life-threatening tachycardia. Each breath came as a monumental effort, his rib cage rising and falling with the rhythm of approaching death. Ethan remained beside Thunder's head, his shackled hands stroking the familiar spot behind the bull's ears that had always provided comfort. Sarah knelt on Thunder's other side, her veterinary training telling her what her heart refused to accept. They were witnessing the final moments of an extraordinary life. "He held on for you," Sarah whispered to Ethan, tears streaming down her face. For 5 years, he refused to give up because he knew you needed him. The monitors attached to Thunder's massive form beeped with increasing urgency, their electronic warnings creating a counterpoint to the bull's labored breathing. Dr. Foster worked with grim determination, adjusting medications and monitoring vital signs, but her expression conveyed what she couldn't speak aloud. "Can you save him?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking with the weight of impending loss. "Doctor." Foster met his eyes with painful honesty. "His heart is failing, Ethan. The stress of carrying that evidence, of waiting for you, of fighting to stay alive, it's destroyed his cardiovascular system. Even if we could perform a heart transplant, which we can't, his other organs are shutting down." Thunder's eyes, those intelligent brown orbs that had watched over Ethan through countless nights of PTSD episodes, fixed on his human's face with unmistakable recognition. Despite the pain, despite the medications, despite the mechanical failure of his massive body, Thunder's consciousness remained focused on the man he'd spent his life protecting. Back in the courthouse, Marcus Kellerman's arrival in federal custody created chaos that penetrated even Judge Blackstone's soundproofed chambers. The casino developer, his expensive suit rumpled from arrest and his silver hair disheveled, was escorted through corridors lined with media cameras and shouting reporters. "Mr. Kellerman has agreed to cooperate fully with federal investigators," announced his attorney. A sharp-faced woman whose reputation for damage control preceded her into the room. "In exchange for consideration in sentencing, my client is prepared to provide testimony regarding his business relationships with certain judicial and law enforcement officials." Judge Blackstone's composure finally cracked. The careful mask of judicial dignity slipped as he realized his decades of corruption were about to be exposed. His thoughts turned to his son Michael, who died in what everyone believed was a drunk driving accident 10 years earlier. "Your Honor," Martha Hendricks said quietly, "perhaps this would be an appropriate time for you to recuse yourself from these proceedings." The suggestion carried the weight of inevitability. Blackstone understood that his judicial career was ending, but the manner of its conclusion would determine whether he faced disgrace or federal prison. "I need to make a statement," Blackstone said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The confession that followed would ultimately expose a conspiracy spanning 3 decades and involving dozens of officials across Texas. Blackstone detailed how Marcus Kellerman had approached him 15 years earlier, offering financial assistance for his son's experimental cancer treatments. The initial payments seemed harmless. Small favors, minor case adjustments, nothing that violated his judicial oath. But the corruption deepened over time. When Blackstone's wife developed breast cancer, Kellerman's payments increased. When his daughter needed law school funding, offshore accounts provided anonymous scholarships. Each favor demanded greater compromises. Each payment bound him more tightly to Kellerman's criminal enterprise. "My son Michael discovered the truth 5 years ago," Blackstone continued, his voice breaking. "He threatened to expose everything. The car accident that killed him, it wasn't an accident. Kellerman had him murdered, and I knew it, but I was trapped. Every decision I made after that was about survival, about protecting what remained of my family." The revelation that Kellerman had murdered Judge Blackstone's son sent shockwaves through the assembled law enforcement officials. The casino developer's crimes extended far beyond land fraud and judicial corruption. He was a serial killer who'd eliminated anyone threatening his business empire. Martha Hendricks leaned forward, her FBI training recognizing the significance of Blackstone's confession. "Your Honor, how many other cases were influenced by your relationship with Kellerman?" 17, Blackstone whispered. 17 wrongful convictions over 10 years. Men and women who went to prison, some who died there, because I valued my family's survival over justice. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. 17 innocent people had paid the price for Blackstone's corruption, their lives destroyed to protect Kellerman's criminal enterprise. Back at the prison, Thunder's breathing had become increasingly shallow, each inhalation requiring tremendous effort. The monitors showed heart rhythms that should have been incompatible with consciousness, yet the bull's eyes remained alert, focused on Ethan with unwavering devotion. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said to Ethan, her voice barely audible above the medical equipment's electronic sounds. "Thunder's been fighting this heart condition for over a year. The veterinary cardiologist said he should have died months ago, but he kept defying every medical prediction." Ethan stroked Thunder's muzzle, feeling the familiar warmth that had comforted him through countless nights of war-induced nightmares. "You were waiting for me to be free, weren't you, boy? You couldn't let go until you knew I was safe." Thunder's response was barely perceptible, a slight movement of his massive head that pressed more firmly against Ethan's palm. The gesture carried 5 years of accumulated love, loyalty, and unshakable faith in his human's innocence. Dr. Foster checked her monitors one final time, her professional demeanor barely containing her personal grief. In 30 years of veterinary practice, she'd never encountered an animal whose emotional bonds transcended biological limitations. "His heart is stopping," she announced quietly. "There's nothing more we can do." The words triggered a chain reaction of activity. Warden Stone received confirmation that federal authorities were assuming jurisdiction over Ethan's case. The execution scheduled for 30 minutes away was officially canceled, but the victory felt hollow as Thunder's life ebbed away in the makeshift medical bay. Thunder's final breath came as courthouse bells chimed noon, marking not just the passage of time, but the end of an extraordinary life lived in service to love and truth. His massive form grew still, but his eyes remained open, fixed on Ethan's face with an expression of profound peace. The bull who'd carried justice in his belly for 5 years had finally delivered his most precious cargo, his human's freedom. The silence that followed Thunder's final breath stretched across the makeshift medical bay like a physical presence, broken only by the electronic flatline of monitors that no longer served any purpose. Ethan remained motionless beside his companion's massive head, his shackled hands resting on the still warm hide that had been his anchor through 8 years of storms. Sarah's sobs echoed off the concrete walls, her grief compounded by the cruel irony that Thunder's death had coincided with Ethan's salvation. The veterinarian who'd fought to keep the bull alive through 5 years of decline now faced the professional duty of declaring him officially deceased. Her hands trembled as she reached for the clipboard that would record the time of death at 12:03 p.m. "He waited," Martha Henderson whispered, her 85-year-old frame shaking with emotion as she approached Thunder's still form. "That magnificent creature held on just long enough to save his boy, then let himself go home." Dr. Foster silently began disconnecting the monitoring equipment, her movements mechanical as she processed the medical impossibility she'd just witnessed. Thunder's heart condition should have killed him months ago, yet he'd survived until this precise moment, as if his failing organ had been sustained by pure will rather than veterinary intervention. Warden Stone stood in the doorway, her 30 years of corrections experience inadequate preparation for the scene before her. She'd overseen dozens of executions, witnessed the full spectrum of human emotion in her sterile institutional environment, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of a man grieving over a bull who died to prove his innocence. The warden's radio crackled with updates from the courthouse. Federal agents had taken Marcus Kellerman into custody. Judge Blackstone was being processed for federal corruption charges, and Governor Richards was personally reviewing Ethan's case for immediate clemency. The machinery of justice, so long corrupted by greed and conspiracy, was finally grinding toward truth. But for Ethan Cross, none of it mattered. The freedom he'd dreamed of for 5 years tasted like ashes in his mouth as he stared at Thunder's motionless form. The bull who'd been his salvation, his therapy, his closest companion, had sacrificed everything to deliver that freedom. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered to Thunder's still ears. "I'm so sorry you had to carry that burden alone for so long. I should have understood what you were trying to tell me." Detective Kane entered the medical bay with news that should have brought celebration. DNA analysis of the ring fragment had definitively placed Marcus Kellerman at the Morrison murder scene. Combined with Judge Blackstone's confession and financial records documenting the corruption conspiracy, the evidence was overwhelming. "Ethan," Kane said gently, approaching the grieving man with the careful respect reserved for the wrongfully condemned. "Federal prosecutors are dropping all charges. You're going to be released within the hour." The words that should have brought joy instead triggered a fresh wave of grief. Ethan's freedom felt meaningless without Thunder to share it. The ranch they'd built together, the life they'd planned, the future that had sustained him through 5 years of hell, all of it seemed empty without his four-legged partner. Sarah knelt beside Ethan, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, but her need to comfort him overriding physical discomfort. "He knew," she said softly. "Somehow Thunder knew this day would come." "He held on because he couldn't bear to leave you still trapped in here." "What am I supposed to do now?" Ethan asked, his voice hollow with loss. "Everything I built, everything I planned, it was all centered around him. How do I go home to a ranch where Thunder won't be waiting at the gate?" The question hung in the air unanswered because there was no adequate response. Thunder hadn't just been a pet or even a therapy animal. He'd been family, partner, and guardian angel, wrapped in 1,200 pounds of black and red-brown hide. Martha Henderson, her true identity as retired FBI Director Martha Hendricks now revealed, approached with the measured steps of someone bearing difficult news. "Ethan, there's something else you need to know about Thunder's death. The veterinary examination revealed something extraordinary." Dr. Foster stepped forward, her clipboard heavy with medical findings that defied conventional explanation. Thunder's heart showed evidence of multiple previous cardiac events, essentially heart attacks that should have been fatal. The scarring patterns suggest he'd been experiencing cardiac episodes for over 2 years. "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, though her veterinary training already suggested the devastating answer. "It means Thunder was literally dying of heartbreak," Dr. Foster explained, her professional composure cracking under the weight of her findings. The stress of separation from Ethan, combined with the knowledge of injustice he couldn't communicate, was slowly killing him. Every day of the last 5 years was borrowed time. The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. Not only had Thunder carried the evidence of his innocence for 5 years, but he'd also been slowly dying from the pain of their separation. The bull's declining health hadn't been random. It had been a direct result of Ethan's wrongful imprisonment. "He was grieving himself to death," Martha said quietly. "Animals can die of broken hearts just like humans. Thunder's body was shutting down because his spirit couldn't accept being separated from you." Warden Stone's radio crackled again with news from the outside world. Media trucks were surrounding the prison as word of the extraordinary case spread across national news networks. The story of a bull who'd preserved evidence in his stomach for 5 years to save his wrongfully convicted owner was capturing international attention. But the media circus felt surreal and distant to those gathered around Thunder's body. The bull who'd become an overnight sensation would never know of his fame, would never experience the vindication his sacrifice had earned. "We need to discuss arrangements," Dr. Foster said gently, approaching the practical matters that death always demanded. "Thunder's body. There are decisions to be made. Ethan looked up from his position beside Thunder's head, his eyes red with grief but burning with sudden determination. "I want him buried at the ranch, on the hill overlooking the pasture where he used to graze. He needs to go home." "Ethan," Sarah said softly, "the ranch, we lost it to legal fees 3 years ago. The bank foreclosed and it's been sold twice since then." The revelation that his beloved ranch was gone, that the home he'd shared with Thunder no longer belonged to them, added another layer of loss to an already unbearable day. Everything that had defined their life together had been stripped away by the corruption that had stolen 5 years from both man and bull. "Then where?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking. "Where can I take him home to?" Martha Henderson stepped forward, her aged hands reaching out to clasp Ethan's shackled ones. "My land borders where your ranch used to be. Thunder spent half his time on my side of the fence anyway, eating my biscuits and listening to my stories. He can rest there, overlooking the hills he loved." The offer brought fresh tears to Ethan's eyes. In the midst of loss and legal vindication, the simple kindness of an elderly neighbor offered a path toward healing. Thunder would rest where he could watch over the land he'd called home, where the morning sun would warm the earth above his grave. Federal agents arrived to process Ethan's release, their paperwork and procedures a stark contrast to the emotional devastation of the medical bay. The man who'd entered death row that morning as a condemned killer would leave as a free citizen, his name cleared and his innocence proclaimed. But freedom came with a price, measured in the life of the most loyal friend he'd ever known. As Thunder's body was carefully transported from the prison, Ethan realized that his journey toward justice was ending just as his journey through grief was beginning. The bull who'd saved his life was going home at last, but he would make that final journey alone. The federal courthouse in Austin buzzed with unprecedented activity as Marcus Kellerman's empire crumbled in real time. FBI agents wheeled out box after box of evidence while reporters crowded the marble steps, their cameras capturing the downfall of a man who'd controlled Texas politics for 3 decades through murder and corruption. Inside Conference Room 4B, Kellerman sat across from federal prosecutors, his silver hair disheveled and his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in federal custody. The casino developer who'd once commanded fear and respect now resembled a cornered animal, his arrogance replaced by desperate calculation. "Mr. Kellerman," U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh began, spreading crime scene photos across the polished table. "We have DNA evidence placing you at Samuel Morrison's murder scene. We have financial records documenting your bribes to Judge Blackstone. And we have testimony from 17 wrongfully convicted individuals whose cases you influenced." Kellerman's attorney, Patricia Stevens, leaned forward with practiced composure. "My client is prepared to discuss a plea arrangement in exchange for full cooperation with ongoing federal investigations." The confession that followed would expose the largest corruption network in Texas history. Kellerman detailed how he'd built his empire through systematic elimination of anyone who threatened his land acquisition schemes, ranchers who refused to sell, environmental activists who blocked development permits, politicians who couldn't be bought. All had met convenient accidents or been framed for crimes they didn't commit. Samuel Morrison was going to expose the casino development conspiracy, Kellerman admitted, his voice devoid of emotion. He had documentation of bribes, environmental report falsifications, offshore accounts. "I couldn't let him destroy 20 years of work." U.S. Attorney Walsh studied the man who'd ordered dozens of murders with the casual indifference of someone swatting flies. "And Ethan Cross? Why frame him specifically?" "Cross was convenient," Kellerman replied with chilling pragmatism. He had security clearance at Morrison's ranch, access to the murder scene, and a previous disagreement with the victim that witnesses had observed. Plus, his military background and PTSD made him an easy target for a jury. The revelation that Ethan's service-related trauma had been weaponized against him sent shockwaves through the federal team. Kellerman had exploited society's prejudices against veterans struggling with mental health, turning Ethan's sacrifice for his country into evidence of his supposed guilt. "What about the bull?" Agent Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Thunder nearly died preserving evidence of your guilt." "Did you know what that animal was carrying?" Kellerman's facade cracked for the first time, revealing something approaching genuine surprise. "I knew the beast had been agitated during the murder, but I assumed it was normal animal behavior. I had no idea it had ingested part of my ring during the struggle with Morrison." The casual dismissal of Thunder as the Beast highlighted Kellerman's fundamental inability to understand the bonds that connected Ethan to his companion. To the casino developer, Thunder had been merely an inconvenient witness to be ignored, not a sentient being capable of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Meanwhile, at Martha Henderson's ranch, Ethan stood on the hill where Thunder would be laid to rest. The old woman had insisted on purchasing the adjacent property from its current owners, her FBI pension, and decades of careful investments providing the funds necessary to reunite the land that had once been Cross Creek Ranch. "He loved this view," Ethan said quietly, his eyes sweeping across the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. Even in his grief, he could see why Thunder had chosen to spend his final years looking out over this landscape, waiting for a reunion that had come too late. Sarah stood beside him, her pregnancy now showing clearly beneath her black dress. The twins she carried would grow up hearing stories about the bull who'd saved their father, about loyalty that transcended species, and love that conquered even death. "We'll tell them about him," Sarah promised, her hand finding Ethan's as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. "Samuel and Hope will know about Uncle Thunder, about how he never gave up believing in you." The names they'd chosen for their children honored both the victim whose murder had destroyed their lives and the hope that Thunder's sacrifice had ultimately restored. Samuel Morrison's death would be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as the catalyst that exposed decades of corruption and freed 17 wrongfully convicted individuals. Dr. Foster supervised Thunder's burial with the same care she'd shown throughout his medical treatment. The massive bull was laid to rest in a custom-built concrete vault, his body positioned so he appeared to be sleeping peacefully beneath the oak tree that had shaded him during countless afternoons of contentment. As dirt filled the grave, Ethan found himself remembering not Thunder's death, but his life. The scared calf who'd trusted a broken veteran, the gentle giant who'd carried children on his back, the therapy animal who'd soothed nightmares with his steady presence, the loyal friend who'd waited 5 years for justice. "He was more than a pet," Reverend Tucker said during the simple graveside service. "Thunder embodied the kind of faithfulness that humans aspire to, but rarely achieve." His love was unconditional, his loyalty unwavering, his sacrifice complete. The gathering was small. Sarah, Martha, Dr. Foster, Detective Kane, and a handful of neighbors who'd known Thunder during his years of waiting. But the simplicity felt appropriate for a bull who'd never sought fame or recognition, only the return of his beloved human. As the service concluded, a surprising visitor arrived. Judge Harold Blackstone, released on federal bond pending his corruption trial, approached the grave with visible difficulty. The former judge's face showed the toll of recent revelations, his judicial robes replaced by the humble clothing of a man facing disgrace. "I need to apologize," Blackstone said, his voice barely audible. "Not just to you, Ethan, but to Thunder. That magnificent animal suffered for 5 years because of my corruption, because I chose my family's comfort over justice." Ethan studied the man who'd sentenced him to death, searching for anger that no longer seemed important. Thunder's sacrifice had been about love, not vengeance, and maintaining hatred would dishonor that sacrifice. "Thunder forgave you before you even asked," Ethan replied quietly. He wasn't carrying that evidence for revenge. He was carrying it for truth. That's all he ever wanted. Blackstone knelt beside the fresh grave, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers on the mounded earth. "I'll make sure the other 17 cases are reviewed immediately. Every person wrongfully convicted because of my corruption will have their freedom restored." The promise couldn't resurrect Thunder or restore the years stolen from innocent people, but it represented a commitment to honor the bull's sacrifice by ensuring justice for others. Thunder's death would prevent future injustices, his story serving as a reminder that truth eventually surfaces, regardless of how deeply it's buried. As darkness fell over the hill country, the mourners gradually departed, leaving Ethan alone beside Thunder's grave. Sarah had wanted to stay, but her pregnancy demanded rest, and Martha had insisted on driving her home after an emotionally exhausting day. Detective Kane was the last to leave, his 32 years of law enforcement providing perspective on the extraordinary events they'd witnessed. "In all my years as a cop," he told Ethan, "I've never seen anything like what Thunder did. Animals don't understand justice the way we do, but somehow he knew you needed that evidence preserved." "He understood love," Ethan replied, his hand resting on the wooden marker that would soon be replaced by a proper headstone. "And sometimes love is the only justice that really matters." Under the Texas stars, Ethan kept vigil beside his companion's grave, sharing memories with the spirit of a bull who'd redefined the meaning of loyalty. Thunder couldn't hear the words anymore, but Ethan spoke them anyway. Apologies for the years of separation, gratitude for the sacrifice, promises to honor the love that had saved his life. The man who'd entered that morning as a condemned prisoner would leave as a free citizen, his name cleared and his future restored. But freedom came with the weight of Thunder's sacrifice, a debt that could only be repaid by living a life worthy of such devotion. As dawn approached, Ethan finally rose from his vigil, his decision made. Thunder's grave would not be a monument to death, but a foundation for new life. The ranch would be rebuilt not as it was, but as it should be, a sanctuary for animals like Thunder, a therapy center for veterans like himself, a place where broken souls could find healing in the patient love of four-legged angels. Thunder's story was ending, but his legacy was just beginning. 6 months after Thunder's burial, Cross Creek Ranch rose from its ashes like a phoenix, rebuilt not just with timber and stone, but with the kind of purpose that transforms tragedy into triumph. The new facility sprawled across 200 acres of hill country paradise, its modern veterinary hospital and therapy barns standing testament to one bull's extraordinary sacrifice. Ethan Cross stood on the wraparound porch of his new home, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope. In his arms, he cradled Samuel Morrison Cross, his 3-month-old son who bore the name of the man whose murder had nearly destroyed their family. Beside him, Sarah rocked baby Hope, their daughter whose very existence proved that light could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. "They're waking up the whole ranch," Sarah laughed softly as both babies began their morning chorus of demands for breakfast. The sound carried across the property, where a dozen rescued animals were beginning their own daily routines. The Thunder Memorial Therapy Ranch had become a sanctuary for both animals and humans who needed healing. Veterans struggling with PTSD found peace working with rescued cattle, their patient strength echoing Thunder's own therapeutic gifts. Children with autism discovered communication through gentle giants who spoke the language of the heart rather than words. Martha Henderson, now 86 and officially the ranch's chief biscuit officer, emerged from the main barn with her daily entourage of rescued calves. Her morning routine hadn't changed much. She still distributed breakfast treats while sharing stories that her animal audience seemed to understand perfectly. "Morning, babies," she called to the twins, her voice carrying the joy of a woman who'd found family in the most unexpected places. "Uncle Thunder's watching over you from his hill, making sure you grow up strong and true." Thunder's grave had become the ranch's spiritual center, marked by a bronze statue that captured the bull's gentle strength and intelligent eyes. Visitors from around the world came to pay respects to the animal whose story had redefined their understanding of loyalty and sacrifice. Dr. Foster arrived for her weekly visit, her veterinary practice now closely partnered with the ranch's therapeutic programs. In the months since Thunder's death, she'd treated dozens of animals rescued from neglect and abuse, each one finding healing in the peaceful environment that Thunder's sacrifice had made possible. "How are our newest residents adjusting?" she asked Ethan, referring to the 3 Brahman calves who'd arrived the previous week from a bankrupted ranch in East Texas. "Better than expected," Ethan replied, watching the young bulls graze peacefully in Thunder's former pasture. "It's like they know this is a safe place. Animals have instincts about these things." The largest of the 3 calves, a black and red-brown bull calf they'd named Justice, showed remarkable intelligence and gentleness that reminded everyone of Thunder. Justice had naturally assumed the role of herd protector, positioning himself between the smaller animals and any perceived threats with the same instinctive courage his predecessor had shown. Detective Kane visited monthly, his retirement from law enforcement allowing him to volunteer as the ranch's security coordinator. The gruff investigator had found unexpected peace in the company of rescued animals, his decades of witnessing human cruelty balanced by daily exposure to unconditional love. "Got news from Austin," Kane announced, joining Ethan on the porch. "Marcus Kellerman's sentencing came down yesterday. Life without parole plus consecutive terms for the 17 wrongful convictions. He'll die in federal prison." The news should have brought satisfaction, but Ethan felt only a quiet sense of closure. Kellerman's punishment couldn't resurrect Thunder or restore the years stolen from innocent people, but it ensured that the casino developer would never again destroy lives for profit. "What about the other cases?" Sarah asked, her legal training making her acutely aware of the broader implications of Kellerman's crimes. "All 17 convictions have been overturned," Kane reported with satisfaction. "The state's paying substantial settlements, and Governor Richards has established a wrongful conviction compensation fund in Thunder's name. That bull's legacy is freeing people he never met." The Thunder Foundation had become a model for criminal justice reform, its mission expanding beyond animal therapy to include legal advocacy for the wrongfully convicted. Sarah, despite her veterinary background, had emerged as one of the Foundation's most effective legal coordinators, her personal experience with the system's failures driving her passion for reform. Reverend Tucker arrived for his weekly blessing of the ranch's new animals, his gentle ministry extending to creatures who couldn't understand his words, but somehow absorbed his peaceful presence. The elderly chaplain had officiated at Thunder's memorial service 6 months earlier, and his continued involvement with the ranch reflected his belief that divine love transcended species boundaries. "How's our documentary friend doing?" Tucker asked, referring to the film crew that had been documenting the ranch's first year of operation. "Filming the final interviews today," Ethan replied. "The producer says Thunder's story could change how people think about animal intelligence and emotional capacity." The documentary, Thunder's Truth, was scheduled to premiere at the Sundance Film Festival, with proceeds supporting both the ranch and wrongful conviction advocacy programs. Thunder's story had already inspired legislation in 3 states requiring preservation of potential animal evidence in criminal cases. As afternoon settled over the ranch, families began arriving for the day's therapy sessions. Combat veterans worked alongside their children, learning to process trauma through interactions with animals who understood suffering without judgment. The healing that occurred in Thunder's shadow validated every sacrifice that had brought them to this moment. Ethan found himself drawn to Thunder's grave as evening approached, a daily pilgrimage that had become as natural as breathing. The bronze statue gleamed in the fading light, capturing something essential about the bull's spirit that transcended physical death. "We did it, boy," Ethan whispered, settling onto the bench Martha had installed beside the grave. "Everything you held on for, everything you sacrificed for, it's all coming true." Sarah joined him with the twins, their evening routine now including this moment of gratitude beside Thunder's final resting place. Samuel and Hope were too young to understand their debt to the bull who'd saved their father, but they would grow up knowing Thunder's story, carrying his legacy of loyalty and truth into their own futures. The ranch's evening chorus began as animals settled for the night. Cattle lowing softly, horses nickering to their foals, the gentle sounds of creatures who knew they were safe and loved. It was the sound Thunder had waited 5 years to hear again, the music of home and family restored. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Sarah said, her voice soft with wonder. "How Thunder held that evidence inside him for 5 years, never knowing if anyone would understand what he was trying to tell us." "He knew," Ethan replied with certainty that came from 8 years of partnership with an extraordinary animal. Maybe not the details, but he knew that love always finds a way to tell the truth. As stars appeared over the hill country, the Cross family made their way back to the house where Thunder's portrait held a place of honor above the fireplace. The bull who'd saved them all looked down with gentle eyes, his vigil complete, but his love eternal. Sometimes justice had 4 legs and weighed 200 pounds. Sometimes the most profound truths were carried in the hearts of creatures who couldn't speak. And sometimes love was indeed the only justice that truly mattered. The Thunder Memorial Therapy Ranch stood as proof that redemption was possible, that broken lives could be rebuilt, and that the sacrifice of one extraordinary bull could ripple outward to heal a wounded world. Thunder was home at last, and his legacy would endure forever. Friends, let me tell you about the kind of loyalty we used to understand back when a handshake meant something and family came first. Thunder's story reminds us that in a world where truth seems flexible and justice can be bought, some bonds remain unbreakable. That magnificent bull carried the evidence of his human's innocence for 5 long years, his love never wavering even as his own heart was breaking. Just like the greatest generation that built this country with calloused hands and unwavering principles, Thunder never gave up hope. He understood what we've always known, that family isn't just blood, it's who shows up when everyone else walks away. When Martha Henderson, at 85, opened her heart and home to that grieving bull, she showed the same neighborly spirit that once defined small-town America. Today, as we watch families scattered across the country and values that once seemed sacred crumbling around us, Thunder's story brings us back to what really matters. Loyalty that doesn't depend on convenience, love that doesn't calculate the cost, and faith that justice will prevail. Sometimes the most important truths have 4 legs and a heart bigger than Texas. Share your thoughts. Have you ever experienced the kind of unconditional loyalty Thunder showed? What animal companion has touched your heart the deepest, and how did they change your life? The night Samuel Morrison died, Thunder had tried to save his human in the only way an animal could, by destroying the evidence that would damn him. Ethan remembered every detail of that August evening. The security consultation at Morrison Ranch had run late, the wealthy landowner increasingly paranoid about threats to his property. Morrison had been agitated, pacing his oak-paneled office while discussing his plans to expose what he called the biggest land grab conspiracy in Texas history. "They think they can force me out," Morrison had said, his weathered hands shaking as he poured bourbon. Kellerman and his casino cronies don't know who they're dealing with. I've got documents that'll send half the county commissioners to federal prison." Ethan had left Thunder in the truck while conducting his perimeter inspection, a routine security sweep that should have taken 30 minutes. The Brahman bull waited patiently in the custom trailer, accustomed to these late-night jobs that helped pay for his expensive diet and medical care. It was nearly midnight when Ethan returned to find Thunder in a state of panic, unlike anything he'd ever witnessed. The massive bull was thrashing against the trailer walls, his eyes wild with terror, foam dripping from his muzzle. Ethan's leather jacket, which he'd left draped over the truck's tailgate, lay shredded on the ground. "Easy, boy," Ethan had whispered, his own heart racing as he tried to calm his companion. "What's got you so worked up?" Thunder had continued his frantic attempts to destroy the jacket, pawing at the scattered leather pieces with desperate urgency. To Ethan, exhausted from the long day and still processing Morrison's paranoid ramblings, it looked like inexplicable animal behavior. Perhaps Thunder had been startled by a coyote or rattlesnake. What Ethan couldn't know was that Thunder had witnessed everything through the ranch office window. The bull had watched Marcus Kellerman enter through the back door while Ethan was checking the north pasture. He'd seen the struggle, heard Morrison's muffled screams, witnessed the wealthy developer plunge a hunting knife into the old rancher's chest. Most importantly, Thunder had observed Kellerman methodically planting evidence, wiping Morrison's blood on Ethan's jacket, pressing Ethan's hand around the knife handle using Morrison's own gloves, staging the scene with calculated precision. When Kellerman emerged from the office, Thunder's animal instincts had screamed danger. The bull recognized the scent of death, the metallic tang of fresh blood, the predatory satisfaction radiating from the killer. But trapped in the trailer, Thunder could only watch as the man who would destroy his family walked away into the night. The jacket became Thunder's obsession. Every fiber of the bull's being understood that this piece of clothing would bring harm to his human, so he attacked it with desperate fury, trying to obliterate the planted evidence before Ethan could unknowingly carry it home. By the time Ethan managed to load the distressed fragments into a garbage bag, Thunder had worked himself into near collapse. The bull's massive frame shook with exhaustion, his breathing labored from the sustained panic attack. Ethan, interpreting this as illness rather than terror, had driven straight to Sarah's emergency clinic. "His vitals are through the roof," Sarah had said after examining Thunder that night. "Heart rate, blood pressure, stress hormones. It's like he's seen a ghost." She'd sedated Thunder for the drive home, the bull finally falling into an uneasy sleep in his familiar stall. But even unconscious, Thunder's legs twitched as if running, his low moans echoing through the barn like warnings that no human could understand. The next morning brought sirens and flashing lights to Cross Creek Ranch. Detective Robert Kane and his team arrived with a search warrant and grim faces. Samuel Morrison's body had been discovered by his housekeeper at dawn, and preliminary evidence pointed to one suspect. Thunder emerged from his stall to witness his worst nightmare unfolding. Uniformed officers surrounded Ethan, metal restraints clicking around his wrists while voices discussed fingerprints and motives and overwhelming evidence of guilt. The bull's desperate attempts to interpose himself between Ethan and the officers were misinterpreted as dangerous animal behavior. "Get that bull secured," Kane had ordered. "We don't need a ton of angry beef interfering with an arrest." As Ethan was led away in handcuffs, Thunder's bellow of anguish echoed across the hill country. The sound was so raw, so heartbroken, that even the hardened detective paused. But the moment passed, and the cruiser carrying Ethan disappeared down the gravel drive, leaving Thunder alone with his terrible knowledge. Sarah found Thunder 3 days later, still standing at the ranch gate, his massive head pressed against the metal bars, as if willing Ethan to return. The bull had refused all food and water, his body beginning the slow process of grief-induced starvation that would continue for the next 5 years. The call came at 5:47 a.m. on execution day, shattering what little sleep Sarah Matthews had managed. Dr. Amanda Foster's voice cracked with exhaustion as she delivered the news that would change everything. "Sarah, you need to get here now." Thunder collapsed around midnight. His heart is failing. Sarah's hands trembled as she dressed, her 12-week pregnant belly making every movement awkward. For 5 years, she'd watched Thunder slowly deteriorate, but she'd always believed they had more time. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same day Ethan was scheduled to die, Thunder was giving up his fight to live. At the veterinary hospital, Sarah found Thunder lying on his side in the large animal bay, his massive frame connected to monitors that beeped with alarming irregularity. The once proud bull who'd weighed 400 pounds in his prime now barely reached 900. His ribs showed through dull hide, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. "Severe cardiomyopathy, doctor," Foster explained, her clipboard heavy with test results. "His heart muscle is essentially giving out from prolonged stress. We're talking about a condition typically seen in humans who've suffered extreme emotional trauma." Sarah knelt beside Thunder's head, her fingers finding the familiar spot behind his ears that had always calmed him. For the first time in months, Thunder's eyes focused on her face, and she saw a flicker of the intelligence that had once amazed everyone who met him. "The surgery would cost $50,000, Dr. Foster continued gently. "Even then, his chances are maybe 30%. Sarah, honey, maybe it's time to let him go peacefully." Across town, Detective Robert Kane sat in his cramped office at 6:15 a.m., surrounded by evidence boxes that had haunted him for months. At 58, with 32 years on the force, Kane had built his reputation on solving impossible cases. But something about the Morrison murder had never sat right with him. The breakthrough came buried in a misfiled forensic report from the crime scene, blood evidence that didn't match Ethan Cross's DNA. Security camera footage from a neighboring ranch that had been mysteriously excluded from the trial. Most damning of all, financial records showing massive payments to Judge Harold Blackstone from offshore accounts linked to Marcus Kellerman's casino development company. Kane's phone rang as he studied bank records that painted a picture of systematic corruption. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but the voice belonged to someone he'd dismissed as a harmless old woman 5 years ago. "Detective Kane, this is Martha Henderson. I think it's time you knew who I really am." The revelation hit Kane like a physical blow. Martha Henderson, the eccentric neighbor who'd insisted on Ethan's innocence, was actually retired FBI Director Martha Hendricks, one of the most respected federal investigators in the Bureau's history. She'd changed her identity and moved to rural Texas specifically to investigate Marcus Kellerman, a man she'd been tracking for 20 years across multiple states and dozens of suspicious deaths. "I've been building a federal case against Kellerman since 1995, Martha explained, her voice carrying the authority Kane remembered from congressional hearings. Samuel Morrison's murder was just the latest in a pattern of eliminating anyone who threatened his land acquisition schemes. Kane's mind reeled as Martha continued. "I have documentation of 17 similar murders across Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Kellerman's operation is worth hundreds of millions. They've been buying judges, prosecutors, and politicians for decades." Meanwhile, at the prison, Warden Rebecca Stone faced her own crisis. The unusual request to allow a dying bull to visit death row had created bureaucratic chaos. The State Corrections Department had no protocols for livestock visits, especially not animals weighing nearly half a ton. "It's a security nightmare," Deputy Warden Charles Murphy argued. "What if the bull attacks someone? What if it's carrying diseases? This is insane, Rebecca. But Stone had read Ethan Cross's complete file the night before, including psychological evaluations that painted a picture of a man who'd never shown violent tendencies. More troubling were the inconsistencies in the evidence, details that had bothered her for months but which she'd dismissed as pre-execution jitters. The phone call from Governor Richards came at 7:30 a.m., just as Stone was reviewing security protocols for the unprecedented visit. The governor's voice was tight with political calculation. "Rebecca, I'm getting calls from federal investigators about the Cross case. There's talk of new evidence, possible corruption in the original trial. I need you to delay the execution until we can sort this out. Sir, we're 3 hours from the scheduled time. The witnesses are already arriving. The medical team is prepared." "I don't care if they're serving breakfast to the press corps," Richards interrupted. "Something very big is happening here, and I will not have this state execute an innocent man on my watch. Find a way to buy us time." Back at the veterinary hospital, Sarah made the decision that would alter the course of everything. Ignoring Dr. Foster's concerns and her own financial limitations, she authorized Thunder's emergency surgery, but more importantly, she loaded the semi-conscious bull into a livestock trailer and began the desperate drive to Lone Star Correctional Institution. "If Thunder's going to die today," she whispered to the laboring animal, "at least he'll die knowing Ethan is okay." As Sarah's trailer pulled onto the highway, followed by Dr. Foster's emergency response vehicle, Detective Kane was racing toward the courthouse with evidence that would expose the biggest corruption scandal in Texas history. Martha Henderson, her true identity finally revealed, was coordinating with federal agents to arrest Marcus Kellerman before he could flee the country. At exactly 8:00 a.m., 3 separate phone calls converged on Warden Stone's office. The governor demanding delay, Detective Kane requesting immediate access to Ethan Cross, and Sarah Matthews crying into her cell phone as Thunder's vital signs flatlined in the trailer. The execution scheduled for 9:00 a.m. would not proceed as planned. But whether Ethan Cross would live to see another sunrise depended on a dying bull's ability to reveal secrets he'd carried for 5 years.